So thank you so much for joining us. Today we have Jennifer Miller with us. She's an award-winning creative director with 25 years of experience telling direct response stories, talking about storytelling that drives revenue growth. So Jennifer, please take it away.
25 years. How can that be when I'm only 25 years old? Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I hope this will be one of the most lively and interesting hours of your day until your Cinco de Mayo plans, at least. But until then, we've got so much to talk about when it comes to raising funds through storytelling. Here's what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. We'll talk about why stories are so powerfully motivating. We'll cover tips and techniques of storytelling you can use in any channel. And we'll share examples so you can actually see these tips in action. And I hope they'll give you inspiration as you look for and tell great stories to generate revenue. My goal is that you can walk away from this webinar with actionable tips you can put into use today. As Nick mentioned, we're going to have a few questions here. So I'm going to start off with a question, which is why stories? Why stories? And I'm looking for a one-word answer, or 2 or 3 words, or hyphenated, but not a whole dialogue there. If you wouldn't mind, why stories? The first word that comes to mind, if you could please drop that into the chat for the hosts. And Nick, if you would be so kind to just read those out as they come in.
We're having a lot of good discussion here. Personable, emotional, relatable, making a connection, compelling. Yep. That idea of impact and inspiration, personalization, common humanity is a theme that we're seeing a little bit of.
Nice.
Makes you relatable and human.
Excellent.
Motivating.
God, you guys get all A+. Webinar's over. I'm just kidding. All true, all true. And I think sort of what we're dancing on, I love the common humanity one. I think the one that we're talking about here is emotion, right? Stories summon emotion. They elicit an emotional response. They make us feel something. And interestingly, stories also help us learn. So if you think back to childhood, there's a rhythm and a cadence and a structure to stories that we've been habituated to since childhood. And in our early years, that helped us process information and make sense of the world. But in fundraising, stories are there to drive emotion, and emotion is what drives action, whether that's becoming more engaged with your cause or making a donation. Now, a great litmus test that I use when it comes to stories is whether they make you feel first and think second. So stories should make you feel first and think second. And let's take an example of that. Okay, everybody knows the movie Titanic. So picture where you were when you saw the movie Titanic. Some of you may have been in an actual movie theater. Some have streamed it. It's a big epic movie, right? There's romance, there's suspense, there's drama, all the things that make a great story. And so in that moment, you're completely swept up. You're at the edge of your seat and you're feeling emotion. But what you're probably not doing in that moment is thinking in this linear way about the depth of the iceberg or how many kilometers away the ship needed to be for the collision. You know, you're not doing any math in your head. You're feeling emotion. That's what good stories do. They make you feel first and think second. And that's also why statistics tell and stories sell. And I mean, statistics have their place in fundraising, certainly. I'm sure you all have used statistics in impact reports or when it comes to your donors and their giving history, just as for a few examples there. But statistics don't really tell your story quite as well as, a story. So stats are not verboten, but you need to choose how to use them wisely. Now, there have been a lot of studies in the last decade precisely about the mechanism that elicits emotion from us because of stories. And this is really fascinating stuff. What researchers have identified is that our brains respond to stories largely because of the hormone oxytocin, which is sometimes called the moral molecule, the cuddle chemical. By the way, our brains love alliteration as well. And it's a hormone that promotes trust, caring, empathy, and bonding. Empathy, very important. Empathy, you're putting yourself in the shoes of someone else to better understand what they're going through, versus sympathy, which is just feeling sorry for someone. So we're going for empathy. And studies have shown an increase in oxytocin after emotionally compelling stories. One researcher took it a step further to see if there was also a corresponding increase in a willingness to take action, such as donating to a charity associated with the story. And in fact, he found that there was. In Why Your Brain Loves Good Storytelling, Dr. Paul Zak says the amount of oxytocin released by the brain predicted how much people were willing to help others, for example, donating money to a charity associated with the narrative. That's great news for us as fundraisers. So we know now stories make us think, they make us feel, and they can make us act. And that's why every organization wants to tell great stories. It's probably why you're all here. At least I hope it's why you're all here. But here's what I've heard from organizations over the years about stories. We want to tell great stories. We don't know where to look. We can't get people to open up. We don't know what makes a good fundraising story. The approval process is too long, on and on and on. So here's my first unofficial tip. Don't think of finding your stories as like looking for a needle in a haystack. Flip that on its head today, Cinco de Mayo, 2022, and think of your organization as being filled with haystacks. Because truly, everyone has a story. Everyone has a story. Now, back in the late 90s, there was this fabulous news segment, one of my favorites on CBS, by reporter Steve Hartman called Everyone Has a Story. And what he would do is he would stand with his back, he would be standing behind, in front of a printed map of the United States. And he would take a dart, this is a pen, not a dart, he would throw it behind him, camera would zoom in to where the dart landed on the map, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Then we would see Steve Hartman, the reporter, in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, flipping through a phone book randomly, putting his finger somewhere, phone book, remember those two, and the camera would zoom in, and the person whose finger he stopped on is who he would go interview to get their story. So let's watch.
Westmoreland County. Here we go. The toughest part about picking people at random and telling their stories is that most people have no idea what their story is. Eyes it.
Sometimes I think I'm boring, and sometimes I think I'm a nobody, and what could anybody be interested in my life?
Well, just give me a minute. Susie Izat lives with her husband Jim and their 3 strong helpers, Joey, Dennis, and Josh.
Wow!
Their family is a Norman Rockwell painting come to life.
There it is.
And yet, time was when Susie couldn't have dreamed of a Christmas like this.
Okay, ready to go, man. Good. Don't run down, over.
I had a hysterectomy on my 25th birthday, actually.
25th?
25th birthday, yeah.
Susie and Jim adopted Josh 5 years later, but decided not to adopt again because the waiting list was so long, choosing instead
You can't catch me.
to become foster parents.
Can you put into words why you like it here so much?
Because they love us and they snuggle us.
They snuggle you.
And he's a snuggle bug.
We fell in love with these kids, and I think it's obvious why we did.
The 2 brothers used to live here in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, an old depressed steel mill town. They first went into foster care about 3 years ago because of neglect. And Susie says when she first met them, they had almost animal-like behavior. They would claw at people. They weren't properly toilet trained, and they didn't know how to use silverware.
Amen.
They have come incredibly far.
Not only do they now know how to use silverware,
That was good night.
Chopsticks?
Yes.
You know how to use those?
Yes.
the boys have scrapbooks full of their new adventures.
This is my first tree that I climbed in my life. I love this page.
Obviously, even though the boys don't officially belong to this family, Susie and Jim have tried to make them feel a part of it, which is why Joey and Dennis say they have just one last favor to ask of the Izats.
Can I be adopted?
Is that your one wish?
Yes.
When Susie first found out she couldn't have kids, she told herself God must have a better plan. Now, 15 years later, she says she knows what it is.
The love that we have in our family is more than I ever want. It's so fulfilling. It's so good.
Pass this over to Joe. Hand it to me.
So, Joey, to answer your question, yes, you will both be adopted just as soon as the judge signs the papers.
Like that, Mom?
And that's the story of the boring woman from Pennsylvania
Perfect.
who thinks she's a nobody with absolutely nothing interesting going on in her life. Steve Hartman, CBS News.
So, someone who didn't think they had any story to tell, in fact, had this wonderful story that was full of empathy and love and hardships overcome, all the great ingredients of a great story. Which gets me to our first tip. This quote from Mother Teresa is well known, and as it turns out, it's also the right way to look at telling your stories. First tip here, focus on one story or one storyline. It's much easier to process the story of one and therefore be engaged emotionally when it's about one person or focused on one storyline. In fact, there's a psychological term for this called the identifiable victim effect, where a focus on one individual's story of hardship or tragedy evokes greater empathy and therefore a greater urge to help than to large numbers of people who are suffering. And you can see how it's hard to imagine if you ask someone for a gift of $100, how that could help 10,000 people, but it's much more realistic to imagine your $100 helping one person or one family. So let's take a look at some photos that really illustrate this point. This photo is from after Hurricane Harvey, if you remember when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston. And this photo demonstrates a large number of people affected by a disaster, lining up to get help, to get relief supplies. And this really shows the scale of the disaster in its own way. So our brains understand the large numbers, our brains understand a lot of people were impacted, but the emotional parts of our brains need to understand that too. And that comes about when you focus on the story of one or storyline of one. This photo is also from Hurricane Harvey, much different photo, and it demonstrates the emotion after the disaster. You can focus here on the mother, her child, and the first responder, and the looks on their faces. The first responder is, he's determined, he's heroic. And the mother, she's concerned, she's relieved. The child cuddled into his mother for comfort and safety. This is the kind of focus on one in imagery versus large numbers that can help you tell your stories more effectively. Next tip is developing a story arc. And this is perhaps not the most important, not the most exciting part of a storytelling, but it's really an important one. It's so necessary. It's well worth the time spent. It's like a blueprint for your house. You can't just start putting up drywall on a roof. You need to know what the structure is. This is a story structure from Pixar. A former Pixar employee posted this on Twitter. Pixar being the animation studio behind movies like Toy Story. And so she posted this, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. And because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. And you can see this story structure is very common. It probably sounds incredibly familiar to you, and it's common because it's effective. It works, and it works for fundraising stories too. So try this framework. Feel free to screenshot it for your fundraising stories to help guide you as you develop your stories. There's also a construct called the hero's journey, and this is used and studied in academia. It's part of narratology and metamythology. There's a lot of ologies involved there, but it's essentially a template where a hero goes on an adventure into the great unknown, is victorious during a crisis, and comes home transformed. You can Google this. There's tons of information about the hero's journey. And when you look at this hero's journey, this is what it looks like. You can see there's 12 milestones along the journey. Somebody goes out into the unknown, they meet a mentor or they're helped. There's trials and tribulations and failures. They grow. There's this sort of rebirth. They change, they get a gift, and they return changed. So you can see it's sort of this full circle story arc. And fundraising stories often follow a similar path. In this construct, the person in the story would be your constituent if you're a nonprofit, and they certainly undergo that journey, but donors do too. They also take a hero's journey when they give. Now, I was trying to think about some movies or novels that we all know that really illustrate the hero's journey. Wizard of Oz came immediately to mind, which probably, like many of you, I've seen 5 billion times. But in Wizard of Oz, Dorothy runs away from her small town in Kansas. She sets off on an adventure into the unknown, and she meets these wonderful helpers who you see here, and they sing and dance, and she gets the gift of realization that there's no place like home. And she returns home changed, telling her Auntie Em she'll never run away again. Another classic example here, It's a Wonderful Life. So same hero's journey, right? Jimmy Stewart plays George Bailey, decides his life isn't worth living, finds a helper in Clarence the Angel, and gets the gift of knowledge that everyone would be far worse off without him, right? But turns out not to be true. He learns that his everyman common life means something, and he wants to live and returns home changed. And so these are just 2 examples, and I'm sure you can think of others. These are just the ones that came to my mind immediately. I would love for you all to put in the chat some examples that you can think of novels or movies that follow that hero's journey. And then maybe at the end of the webinar, we can kind of walk through what some of those examples are. These were just like the immediate first 2 that I could think of. Now, within those story arcs, there's typically a challenge and a solution to identify, right? The challenge or the conflict is the thing in your story to be overcome or solved. That's the need. And donors help solve it through their giving. That's the offer. So stories simply demonstrate how. They're the emotional bridge. And that's really important because it sets up the things donors can solve by giving. That's what you're asking them to do. This example from Lutheran World Relief is a wonderful example of a story-based appeal here. Thank you to Lutheran World Relief for letting me feature this. Thank you to CDR Fundraising Group. Got that out of the way. This is a beautifully told story through words and compelling photos with terrific eye contact. And this is the story of Paulina, who fled wars, faced hunger, and she's now confronted with a new challenge, COVID. This was mailed during COVID, and it's still not really over. But what I want to call out to you is, number one, the great imagery throughout. It really helps guide you in this particular letter throughout the appeal. So it's a visual journey as much as it is in words. And then look at how that challenge is called out right in the subheads. Now she is facing a new killer, the deadly coronavirus. And each day she must choose whether to go hungry or to risk getting sick simply because she is poor. I love how those are called out visually, right? Because, if you scan direct mail appeals, which donors do, your eyes are going to go right to these important points, which are the challenges. And the solution, of course, is that donors can give to help people like Paulina. And that's populated throughout this appeal, but it's also called out in key visual spots, again, so your eye is drawn to it. So when you develop your story arc, make sure you're identifying the challenge and the solution for your donors who are consuming the story, but also think about how you communicate that in your storyline. It's probably one of the most important parts of the fundraising story, what the challenge is and what donors can do or have done to solve it. Now, we know stories matter and words matter, but one of the mistakes that I have seen far too often is that people cram in flowery, superfluous adjectives like that one to try to force the emotion in the story. And what winds up happening is it just sounds contrived. And there's an affliction. There's an actual clinical term for this that I have coined. It's called word bloat. It's a very painful condition. You don't want your stories to suffer from word bloat. So to combat this, please remember this tip. A story told simply is a story told powerfully. A story told simply is a story told powerfully. Let the story itself do the heavy lifting and leave behind the unnecessary adjectives and descriptors. And here's one of the best examples I know of that. This is a story that is powerful and it evokes emotion. Reportedly, it's been penned by Ernest Hemingway, and it's only 6 words long. Right? Does that make you feel something? And no adjectives. So choose your words carefully because each one really counts. Now let's talk about the hook. And this is an important part of the story as well. This is your lead in. This is something that's going to draw you in. Why is a hook important? Well, our attention spans were already short. And if you've been multitasking in the last 20 minutes during this webinar, you have just proven my point. So think about how many charities are vying for attention in direct mail, emails, videos, social posts, TV spots, on and on and on, right? We're surrounded by charities asking donors, asking prospective donors to do something. And a great hook is going to help you cut through the clutter and help draw them into a story. And this is so important for fundraising. We have just a few seconds to get someone's attention, much less keep it and engage them enough for them to feel something and then take action. In that Lutheran World Relief example, that letter I just showed you, this is the envelope that goes with it, which uses a question for the hook. She survived war, but will she survive COVID-19? And questions, by the way, can work really well as a hook or a lead-in because they bring the donor into the story by asking them to engage in an answer rather than just being a declarative statement. And this is a great example from Covenant House, an appeal that I received last holiday season. Look at that first line. Here in the dark, we see God's face a lot. I mean, wow, that's quite a statement. I mean, you have to read more to understand what that means. Now, in truth, the writer could have started this letter with paragraph 2, and that would have been totally fine. That would have been a great lead-in. And actually, paragraph 3 would have been a really great lead-in. Hi, he said, kind of embarrassed. I don't have a place to stay tonight. Some kids told me about your shelter. They said you might let me stay for a night. That's all I want, just one night. That would work really, really well, right? But the writer chose here to use that first line, short, powerful. Here in the dark, we see God's face a lot. And that first line hooked me. I had to read more. This is one of my absolute favorite top tips. Make it authentic. And what does authentic mean? It means the story has to ring true to touch hearts. If it rings true, it can create an emotional connection, and that's what we're going for. And then hopefully action on the part of the donor or prospective donor. And I really believe that donors are smart enough to sniff something out that feels scripted. And so this is where details really, really matter. And there are several tactical things you can keep in mind as a sort of an authenticity check. First, you can simply use the power of someone's own words to tell a story. So think about the first person point of view. Does it always have to be from a CEO of your organization? Could it be from a teacher who's witnessing a child who's going hungry and the impact on their schooling? Or from someone else? Could it be from a parent? Could it be from the child themselves? So think about point of view in terms of the authenticity check. Second, really important, banish words from your story that are jargony or all about your organization instead of your story. And you'll know them when you see them. So if it reads like a press release a little bit, you're probably veering a little bit too far away from the story-based elements that are going to create that emotional connection. Third, bring your donor into the story. You can imagine how she felt. You would feel the same if you had to make that choice, right? You're giving them emotional skin in the game when you pull them into the story. And fourth, really important, details matter, including nonverbal, by the way. So sights, sounds, expressions on faces, those are all cues to our brains, recognizing details that are making something feel authentic. Now, I wanted to share this video with you. It was one of the most shared social videos of 2021. So some of you may recognize this. It's a story that raised money, and it's one of the most authentic reactions I can remember seeing. So this is Kenny. He's a 79-year-old Navy veteran, and he had a mobility scooter, which was in disrepair, and he couldn't afford another one. So his neighbor Amanda raised the funds for a new scooter through social media and then delivered the news to Kenny. Let's watch.
On TikTok, we're all upset that this fine veteran doesn't have a scooter. So I ended up setting up something. It's called GoFundMe. But in 24 hours, people on TikTok, strangers who have never met you but love you, donated $5,000 for a scooter for you.
No, you're kidding. I don't know what to say, Amanda. 5,000, that's so that is so wonderful. I'm sorry for being emotional, but I can't help it.
No, I know, me too.
That is so nice, Amanda. That's the nicest gift I ever had all my life. And then some. I'll try to have with my kids, you know.
I love this video for so many reasons. I mean, just that little bit at the end, he's so emotional, he's so authentic, and he catches himself. He realizes, like, this is the best gift I've ever got, except for my kids. And I mean, that's real. I mean, that's what we do. None of us are polished or scripted. And that's what makes this so amazing. And you have to ask yourself, did that video make you feel something first? That's really that litmus test for a great story. It's that pure joy. It's why we watch videos of dogs, you know, leaping into the arms of their owners after a long absence, or kids, you know, helping each other without being asked. It's just that, it's just authentic and pure. There's another video that was, maybe it was a couple of years ago already, but there were two little boys, I think it was in New York City, and they were running towards each other. It was just pure joy with their arms outstretched. My friend. Oh, it was just, I loved that video so much, but you can see why. It just makes your heart swell. It moves you. And it's incredibly motivating when you have that kind of emotional reaction to a story. Now, one tactical thing here is, imagine if you were interviewing Kenny and this was the interview you got. You know, how would you tell his story? In one part of this video, he takes his hat off and he kind of puts his head down in disbelief and kind of wipes his brow. That's one of those great nonverbal details that you want to capture in your stories so that it rings true. Now, this is another great example of authentic storytelling. This is an acquisition letter from Make-A-Wish Canada. I don't know the agency that developed this. I don't know the writer. I'm pretty sure that this has been a control or still is a control. I believe I've seen this several times throughout the years. It's a fantastic letter, a great example of authentic storytelling. So first, it's from a father whose daughter had cancer and was granted a wish, right? So he says, there's absolutely nothing worse than watching your 3-year-old child die, and there is nothing better than stealing her back from heaven. My daughter Carly came back from certain death thanks to people like you. I mean, simple, powerful. There's a hook. Great storytelling there. And then down here, there's more authenticity. Why? Because there's common ground down here. This is where he says, this is every parent's worst nightmare. My daughter Carly was a perfectly healthy child. Then one day she got a bad fever. We took her to the hospital only to discover every parent's nightmare. Carly had cancer. Okay, first of all, no, that's completely relatable. I mean, every parent does have a worst nightmare. That kind of goes like that. So that's what makes it relatable and authentic. Secondly, if you notice there, then one day she got a bad fever. Remember the Pixar story structure. Ding, ding, picking that up right there. Over here, this is where the father, who is the author of the letter, brings the donor in. The doctors told us she would not live through the weekend. I don't know if you can imagine how horrible it was to hear this news. Our baby was dying. Again, authentic, because bringing me in gives me emotional skin in the game. It's not a story happening over here. Now I'm being asked to imagine it myself. And there's emotion throughout, but the one thing I want to point out here is that there's a lack of that word bloat. You know, there's a part here where he says, when Carly returned 2 weeks later, she had the strength to run into her grandmother's arms. Carly's recovery was amazing. And we can picture and feel that emotion without it being too forced, right? There's not that word bloat weighing it down. It's very simple and therefore very powerful. On the back of the letter, there's more common ground. I know we were lucky. I know that many kids won't get a chance to live long lives, but they can get their most cherished wish fulfilled, right? How many of us wouldn't feel the same when faced with having a child who survived cancer? Again, that common ground. And here, one of the most interesting parts of this letter, there's very little org-centric jargony words. Okay, this story-based letter is not really about Make-A-Wish itself. It's what Make-A-Wish does, as demonstrated by the story and donors who make it happen. Now, if you're lucky enough to have some budget to do some video stories, this is one of the very best ways to be authentic in your storytelling, because connected TV, direct response TV, and linear TV or social video ads can bring stories to life like no other channel. And this video demonstrates that. It's from an organization called Donate Life America, which is a nonprofit promoting organ donation to save and heal lives through transplantation. And the story you're about to see isn't a traditional story with a traditional story arc, which is kind of why I wanted to share it with you, because it's not formulaic, but it is a story about a life-threatening need that donors can help solve.
So healthy. I know. I'm waiting so long. I know, buddy. I know. It went perfect, baby. I can breathe again and talk. You feel good? You feel good? I feel amazing. It's amazing? It's amazing. I never felt so good.
My name is Carla, and we've been waiting for a heart for 2,500 days.
My name is Francisco, and I've been waiting for a heart for 18 months.
Hemos estado esperando un corazón por 1 año y medio. My name is Gavin, and I've been waiting for a heart for 7 years.
I've been waiting 123 days for a heart transplant.
736 days for a heart.
I've been waiting for a heart for 500 days.
So that video gets me every time. Ask yourself if that made you feel first and think second. I mean, there's so many things I love about this video. Yes, there's a clever little hook at the end. It's driving people online to Instagram, all of those things we as fundraisers know we need to do. What got me was that hook, the little boy lying in bed, telling us he can talk, he can breathe, and the authenticity of real people in their own words, talking about how long they've been waiting for a heart. And even, I loved all the nonverbal, you know, the little girl kind of shrugging her shoulders, and there was another woman who moved her glasses to cry. So this is a really great example of how a hook and emotion and authenticity can all work together to create a powerful, powerful story. Now, can't tell great stories if you don't have a culture that supports it. And so this tip is about developing a storytelling culture. And it's not easy to find stories, much less tell them, but they're so important. And if you can get people on board with thinking about storytelling instead of waiting for the story to find you, you'll be further ahead. So here are some ways to do that. First, remember, Everyone has a story, everyone does. And you can start telling stories at staff meetings just to get used to the idea of storytelling as a comfortable form of communication. Challenge yourselves to do that, maybe every other week, maybe not at every staff meeting. And then appoint what I call story sleuths to be on the lookout. So you want to sort of teach them for the things to recognize that make great stories. A lot of times these are your volunteers or social workers, anybody who's interacting with the people who are being helped by your organization. And when they can pick up what those stories are, most of the time they'll hear little brief bits. But if they're trained to have their story antenna up, they'll be able to, aha, that would make a great story. So once you've got them willing and able to kind of do that, you're also going to want to have a way to capture those story leads, because most people are not going to want to share their story on the spot. And so you're going to want to make sure to get their contact information to follow up. So make sure you have an easy way to capture those story leads. You're also going to want to categorize the stories as they come in, whether it's full content or just a brief little lead, so that when you're planning for different stories in whatever channels, whatever times of the year, you've got a place to go to where you can sort of remember, oh, that's right, this was a great Christmas story. Oh, that's right, this was a great summer story. And then finally, I know I just showed you a video that was produced and had nice production value and all of that, but don't forget the power of your phone, which many of you are probably on right now. You can create videos in a very low cost way with your phone. Show real people talking about their journey to inspire your donors. I mean, think about some of the ways that you can have someone do sort of a selfie style video with their phone. Imagine someone who is willing to, do a quick 1-2 minute video who's showing you around their kitchen because their family's facing food insecurity, and they're opening up the cabinets and saying, this is the one jar of peanut butter we have left to last us for the week. So kind of bringing that story to donors in that real, authentic way can be really powerful, and it's low cost. And sometimes, the less, the more unvarnished, unpolished videos can ring true because people can relate. And this is our last tip. This is about asking the right questions. I get asked this a lot over the years. I have interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people over the course of my journalism and fundraising career. And I get asked this all the time. What questions do we ask to get people to give us answers? Like, what are the right questions to ask? What kinds of things do we need to know? And so before you even get to the questions, here are some overall tips for situating everyone to get them comfortable and in the right frame of mind. So first, think of the interview as a conversation, not a Q&A. Sometimes people answer with what they think you want to hear, and that's not what you're really going for here. So you want to just kind of have a conversation, which makes it less formal and takes the pressure off. And then make sure you're set up somewhere comfortable. Just the fact that you're asking someone, is this an okay place to do the interview? Are you comfortable here? Would you prefer to sit outside, or is this private enough for you? Just asking them that shows that you're interested in their comfort level, not yours. So have that situational awareness, that emotional intelligence to make sure that they're comfortable. And once they know that, that how comfortable they are is top of mind for you, they'll open up a little bit more. Keep it to a small group. Ideally it's just you and the person you're interviewing, or group of people you're interviewing. I know that's not always feasible. I've had situations where, there's a giant long conference table with lots of people around it and one person at the end that I'm interviewing, and you need a megaphone. It's probably not the ideal thing, and people really clam up when it's that way. So try to keep it to a very, very, very small group. And then, just start out with some small talk. Don't go right away into the hard-hitting questions. Just try to get people to relax a little bit. I always like to think of it like, in the days before COVID, when you were on an airplane, before masks and everything, there was a whole lot more chatter on the airplanes. It's pretty quiet now, if you notice. And, you're just inches away from someone. So you're in their space, they're in your space. And, while you're waiting for the plane to take off, you just sort of do this little small talk. Is this your final destination? Where are you going? Et cetera, et cetera. And so you're going to want to try to find that kind of small talk to help establish some common ground to kind of set minds at ease and comfort levels. And then don't ask yes or no questions if you can help it. And there's going to be some obvious times where you do have to ask those. And I find myself still doing that sometimes and thinking, oh, that was a yes or no question. Because what happens if you ask a yes or no question, you get a yes or no response, and then there's no other details that are provided. So it sort of doesn't go anywhere. It's also a really good idea to have on hand just some prompts, and feel free to screenshot this as well. So if you feel like you're getting stuck when interviewing someone or the conversation isn't flowing, you know, kind of pull these out to have on standby. But some great lead-ins for your questions are things like, describe for me the moment when, or walk me through a day, or, you know, how did you know you needed to get help? So things that get someone to think more broadly and put their response into their own words, into their own context. Now, I know we said we were going to give you 8 tips, but I've got a bonus one now for you. And I hope this is one you remember as you embark on your next storytelling adventure. And it has to do with Seinfeld. Yes, Seinfeld, the great unknown fundraising agency, right? Well, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Seinfeld. Some of you may have watched it when it actually aired. Others may have watched it in syndication because perhaps you were just being born in the 90s. But one of their most popular episodes is known as the yada, yada, yada episode, right? And that became part of our lexicon. So if you hear yada, 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 that probably came from Seinfeld. So I have this exclusive scoop, you guys, right from the script that I got off the internet, public domain, is a few lines showing how the Seinfeld characters used yada, yada, yada. So Marcy plays the girlfriend of George, the character of George, and she says, you know, a friend of mine thought she got Legionnaire's disease. And George says, really, what happened? And Marcy says, oh, yada, 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 just some bad egg salad. I'll be right back. And Jerry says, I noticed she's big on the phrase yada, yada. And George says, is yada, yada bad? And Jerry says, no, yada, yada is good. She's very succinct. George says she is succinct. And Jerry says, yeah, it's like you're dating USA Today. So here's my bonus tip. Don't yada, yada, yada your story. Details matter. Find the hook, build a story arc, avoid word bloat, use compelling images, and be authentic. And if you take anything away from this webinar, if you've been multitasking or looking for your next meeting at the top of the hour, here are the top 3 things I want you to remember. First, story should make you feel first and think second. If you don't, you know you have a little more work to do with your story. Second, a story told simply is a story told powerfully. Let the story do the heavy lifting. Don't include the adjectives and qualifiers. You don't need them. And third, please be authentic. And remember what Maya Angelou said, which applies to storytelling and to life. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So I hope I've made you feel good about your next adventure in storytelling so that you can engage more donors and drive revenue growth. And so like every good story, we've come to the end of the journey here. And I think we've maybe got time for a few questions, it looks like.
Yes, we do have a few questions. The first one I have to take advantage of because someone answered it in the chat. So the question was, did Lutheran World Relief get better results than the other pieces with that storytelling? And we had someone write in and say, that is their control letter and very hard to beat. So that is the winning story for them.
Great question, great answer. I swear to you, I didn't put a plant in there for that, but I happen to know because we're doing some other things around that particular story and learned the other day that that was a control story. And I can see why. It's very well done. Thank you, Lutheran World Relief. Thank you, CDR Fundraising Group.
And then we have another question. How do you best include descriptions of sights and sounds and those very experiential things in a story without that level of word bloat?
Good question. I think the thing here to remember is try to avoid things like, you know, it was a cold, frigid, rainy night. It was raining cats and dogs, the teeth chattering cold. I think those are the kinds of things that you want to avoid in terms of descriptors. You can just say, it was a very cold night. If that answers the question, I think. In terms of sights and sounds, you know, that's what's happening environmentally outside. So just keep it really, really simple. You know, I think those are great to set the scene, set context, but you're going to want to focus on just the facts of the story. Think about that. It was a cold day and Jane woke up. It was another day, cold in her house too, because she couldn't pay to keep the heat on. She lost her job 2 weeks before. You can kind of see how that goes.
And to your point about details, if you have a detail that tells it without having to go through the list of advocates, she shivered even when she had her coat on. Something like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What about length of stories? How long should stories be, whether video or direct mail, or how do you approach that?
Yeah. The amount of real estate that stories take up certainly depends on the channel. So there are long form TV spots on linear TV that can be 30 minutes, 60 minutes long. They can be 2 minutes long. In connected TV, it's 15 seconds, 30 seconds long. In PSAs, it can range from 15, 30, 1 minute long. So it just depends on the channel. In direct mail, that particular Lutheran World Relief letter was, I believe, a 4-page letter. So front back of 2 sheets of paper. It's really hard to tell a decent story in like a double bucks, like a short little letter. Those are kind of better reserved for, little quick bites, not a complete story-based appeal. And emails, I would say test. Things change so much in emails. I've seen really long stories work. I've seen shorter stories work that are more like photo essays. So you're telling a great story, but it's like photo, caption, photo, caption, photo, caption. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but it's definitely channel dependent.
It's great to know. How do you find stories like these when your organization isn't one that's necessarily this emotional? So this person works for the Catholic Church, but there may be other examples. And the frequent refrain you hear is, well, I don't have puppies and kids, those sorts of things.
Right. Well, puppies and kids are certainly a big draw. They certainly tug on the heartstrings, but I don't think you have to worry about working so hard. Remember, everyone has a story, and look at the two examples that I showed of Paulina. One detail I remember from that actual letter is that she had to estimate her own age because she didn't have a birth certificate. And so there's a lot of details in that story that really make it ring true and draw you in. So I think those details really matter when you're painting a picture of a story for someone who's not a child. And also Kenny, what a great story. Can you imagine the full story if it were told? And he's certainly not a child either, nor an animal. So details matter.
Yeah. How do you approach the request to tell someone's story?
In terms of requesting it from someone directly?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that's the case.
Yeah. Again, I feel like you've got to put it on their comfort level. Be situationally aware, have your emotional hat, your emotionally intelligent hat on there, because you want it to make it less about you, the organization, and how you can benefit from their story. You want to put it on terms that they're really comfortable with. You never want to feel like you're manipulating, exploitive, using their story for your own purposes. You want to make this a really collaborative process. So I would say, wow, you have such an interesting story to share. And, you've been involved with our organization. Can we talk a little bit more about it? You have to kind of tread carefully and kind of wade into the water a little bit just to kind of see what their interest is. There are some people who will outright say, oh, you want me to tell my story? Fine. I love what your organization has done. I'm happy to share my story. And there are others who are a little tentative. I would caution, though, I wouldn't push. If someone's tentative, I don't like the pushing personally. And I think it actually, causes them to sort of close up. And what you want them to be is open and emotional and honest and a little bit vulnerable. And that's a tough place for some people to be. So you really have to kind of read the room carefully when you're approaching people, but make sure you're putting it on their comfort level in terms that make it feel like, you want to hear from them because it's doing something for the greater good, not because it's helpful to you, the organization.
And we have another comment along those lines in the Q&A saying, I want to encourage people who are asking people in need for help to provide a benefit for the person sharing the story. If someone's sharing a story on camera, giving them a grocery store card, those sorts of things. So that was the comment in. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's up to each organization and their comfort level and what leadership there thinks is appropriate. I personally have not been involved in that. I've heard of that, but I certainly encourage people to share their stories because, sort of the pay it forward approach, being grateful. And most people really, honestly, they genuinely are. They're so grateful for the help they've received that they want to share their story so that it can help others.
Well, and to your point of it not being coerced, you wouldn't want that to be the carrot, but rather a benefit afterwards.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Any thoughts on a story that elicits too much emotion and turns people off? This person says, particularly for wildlife and conservation, you could get very sad and make people feel hopeless rather than hopeful.
No, that's a excellent question to whoever posted that. I do. I think it's a very fine, you have to calibrate it very carefully, right? I understand the idea of going too far, and everybody's tolerance and tipping point is different, right? So I think it's something that you have to really be careful about. And I think you need to portray need, but you also want to portray hope. It's sort of this old school thinking used to be, it's got to be all about need, photos of need, sad, sad, sad. And some people will respond to that. Yes, absolutely. And certainly you don't want to shy away from need. That's the whole point of it. You want to present what the challenge is. But let's face it, with all the channels and 24-hour media, we're just seeing bad news and bad headlines all over the place. People have enough of sadness that I think people are really hungry for hopeful sometimes. And I think there's a way to do it, but I couldn't tell you what that exact calibration is. Everything is different, but yes, absolutely. I personally subscribe to the idea that hopeful is a very, very good thing.
Great, thank you. We have in terms of interviewing people, would you say it's good to allow a person to be emotional, not to manipulate them, but rather to allow that emotion to unfold?
100%. When I've interviewed people, I just allow them to be them. I definitely don't, I don't try to channel my Barbara Walters and just make people cry and cry. Usually people just once they're comfortable and they're just telling their story on their terms, the emotion comes pretty organically and naturally. And I think the interviewer's style has a lot to do with it too. And you just have to be really sensitive. So for example, if these are stories of, kids with cancer, adults with cancer, and it's super sensitive, you just got to be really, really careful about and read how people are responding. But I think the emotion comes naturally. You can't help it sometimes. People sometimes they're so relieved. I'll give you one quick example. I was interviewing a mom whose child had cancer, and she was telling me all about the child's cancer and the whole treatment trajectory. And, parents who have kids with cancer, the whole family becomes they're like walking medical dictionaries because that's their world. They live in hospitals and with beeping machines and things like that. And so they talk about the next protocol and things like that. And so she was just framing up the story based on this trajectory of, this chronological, this happened, then we had this happen, and then this treatment. And I just sort of stopped her halfway through and I just said, who's taking care of you? And she just started bawling because she had put herself aside so often and she just needed to kind of hear that. So I think sometimes when people are in a vulnerable space talking about, then they're, emotional already about their story, the emotion comes naturally.
And the person also commented a couple of magic words in that realm. Tell me more, take your time, things that allow for that.
Absolutely, 100%. Please give them the time and space. The worst thing you can do while they're sort of trying to gather their thoughts is, kind of look at your watch, flip through your questions, just allow them really to just tell their authentic story in their own words. And that's going to set you up beautifully.
And then we have a question about the crafting of stories. Fundraisers looking at a DIY approach rather than professional writers, professional storytellers. How do you approach that, and what do you think is the balance there?
Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by do-it-yourself fundraisers rather than professional writers?
So specifically, do you find that the comment is, do you find that fundraisers often do it yourself the writing rather than hiring professional writers?
Do I find that they do that? Do I find that it's effective?
And yes, then do you find that's effective?
Well, here's what, first of all, here's the news flash. I work at a fundraising agency. So I know what I'm going to tell you, but I'm also telling you just personally experience here, professional guidance here. There is definitely a science to direct response writing. I know everybody thinks they're a writer and everybody thinks they're a designer, everybody thinks they're a brilliant musician and all those things, but truly there's an art and a science to direct response creative. And when it comes to writing specifically, there's certainly a scientific part of it where you're sort of setting up the call to action, and there's certain words that if you've spent enough time in the incubator, you just sort of, these things. So it's not that do-it-yourself fundraisers can't do it, but there's a lot of experience and history that goes into professional fundraising writers, and the results, speak for themselves typically.